The Javelin was the first all-new car to appear from a British factory after the Second World War. It was one of the most advanced cars available at the time, and it's still fondly remembered by many motorists who either owned one or wanted one. But it was a commercial failure for its manufacturer. Jowett had built their reputation on a range of solid, old-fashioned cars with reliable flat twin and flat four engines. But the old design was now outclassed, and Jowett realised that to survive as a small company after the war, they needed to move up market. And so they recruited a young designer from the wartime aircraft industry, Gerald Palmer, who saw their future making an upmarket people's car.
I had spent my youth in southern Rhodesia, and from the age of 13 I drove Model T Fords, which were wonderful family cars. The old pre-war Jowetts had something in common with the Model T Ford, and I visualized a family car with adequate seating capacity for 6 people, plenty of luggage accommodation, good suspension, comfort, lightweight. I turned over backwards to keep the weight down. The aim was to get a quart into a pint pot so that the maximum length was allocated to the passenger accommodation and the luggage space, and as little as possible to the power unit.
In company tradition, the engine was a flat 4, but for the first time in a Jowett mounted well forward in front of the radiator to save as much space as possible. The 1500cc engine was a new, more powerful design than in the pre-war cars. The prototypes were originally aluminium. As a small company, Jowett had no steel body pressing facilities, but the design was so good that it attracted a steel body making firm, Briggs of Dagenham, to tool up and supply the finished bodies to Jowett. On May 16, 1947, the car was launched at £800, compared with £500 for an Austin. The motoring press of the day judged the Javelin to be rather expensive, especially compared with some of the other cars then on the market. But it also created a bit of a sensation for its unusually streamlined shape, and you have to remember that they achieved that without the help of a wind tunnel in those days. Testers found the car set new standards of performance and economy, 80 miles an hour and 30 mpg from a 1.5-litre family saloon. That was unheard of, and the lightness of the design gave ride and handling far better than the ponderous family cars of the time. The interior was criticised for its Spartan appearance, but it was praised lavishly for its roominess and comfort. The car became fashionable and popular with enthusiasts. So, with all this praise, why did the Javelin ultimately fail?
In 1949, the market conditions had changed. People were not prepared to pay the price that was being asked. The production of the car was at an average figure of around 70 each week, when it should have been 150. This, of course, had affected the price adversely, and these factors generally made the car non-competitive in the price sense. I propose that in order to lift the sales volume, there might be some virtue in entering competition, motoring in a control sense with the Javelin.
Jowett entered the 1949 24-hour race at Spa, won their class, and found that sales increased. They were now convinced of the value of a sporting image. They developed a sports car, the Javelin Jupiter. It used a more powerful version of the Javelin's engine, and the German tank designer von Eberhorst initially worked on the project. Ready within a year, it went into racing as well. From 1950, for 3 years in succession, the car won the 1.5-litre class at Le Mans. The Jupiter was well received, not least back in Yorkshire, but its development stretched the limited resources of the company and sales were low. The Jupiter prevented much-needed development work on the Javelin, which had never been thoroughly tested and which by now had a reputation for poor reliability. So to save money, the company tried to make its own gearboxes for the Javelin.
This was one of the worst decisions that Jowett, I think, probably made in their whole history. It was a disaster from the beginning. It was a projected disaster. the expertise at Javelin, at Jowett, was not correct for making a gearbox of the type that Henry Meadows had made very satisfactorily for a number of years. And Jowett's required much more time in order to develop their expertise to make an equivalent gearbox, and time was at a premium. And therefore, a number of gearboxes were made which were most unsatisfactory, resulting in cars not being sold, and there was a pile-up of unsold cars and bodies around the factory.
And the problems were compounded because Briggs' bodies were taken over by Ford and gave Jowett a year's notice to find another supplier, potentially a very difficult task.
These factors together prompted the bankers to decide that enough was enough, and they therefore decided to run the business down in a controlled fashion to ensure that eventually the price they obtained for it would be as good as possible.
To try and sell the company, they developed prototypes they had no intention of producing, like this R4 sports car. The factory was sold off to make tractors in 1954 and closed 3 years ago.
I'm afraid they spent a lot of their engineering time, effort and money on producing a sports car and racing a sports car, which was not in the Jowett tradition at all. That is my personal opinion, but it's controversial.
Perhaps Jowett should have developed a sports version of the Javelin instead of the Jupiter. Then maybe they wouldn't have joined that long list of famous British car names that have disappeared since the war.